that I'm going to speak in English from now on. So thank you so much for attending. It's a pleasure to have you all here. I'm António Palmeira. I'm the director of the CIDEFES. That is the research center that we have at the Faculty of Physical Education here in Lusófona. And in the CIDEFES activity plan, annual activity plan, we have several activities such as this, so that we invite someone to share their experience, to network with us, with some students, with some other colleagues, in the sense that these networking opportunities and these learning opportunities are really interesting and important for us. So I'm really grateful to have everyone here, and I think that we can think about these activities as the soil where science grows, and then the networking and relationships that we establish with Professor Ekkekakis, Professor Fernandes, Marta, and other colleagues that show up are the seeds that then come up with as new scientific activities and new scientific initiatives. So I'm pretty sure that we will have a lot of scientific outputs from here, but until now, and even if we don't have those outputs, the time that we spent with Professor Ekkekakis and that we will spend today with Marta, Ricardo, and all of you will be for us enough to be very, very happy. So I will present now these sessions, and I'll sit down and you will listen what there is a lot. So first of all, then to present this session, I would really like to acknowledge and also to say that I'm really grateful for that Professor Ekkekakis was able to manage all of this session. So bringing Professor Ekkekakis here, having this idea to have this session is so everything that goes well is because of him. Everything that doesn't go well is because of us, all the others. So we'll deal from you. Really grateful for this, so I'll leave you to present Professor Ekkekakis.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you for your presence and your interest in this communication. My role here is very, very clear and very simple. I'm just going to present Professor Ekkekakis and try to not occupy too much of his time and his presentation. So, Professor Ekkekakis, I believe, is very well known by the majority of you. His curriculum is very vast. He very kindly sent me a short version of his curriculum, and I will just try to highlight 2 or 3 aspects, because I believe that in this kind of communication, this kind of event where all of us are colleagues and all of us know each other's work, I believe that an extensive presentation is not needed. So, Professor Ekkekakis is a professor of exercise psychology. After a 22-year career at Iowa State University, he now serves as a professor and chair at the Department of Kinesiology in Michigan State University. He is an elected fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine and the National Academy of Kinesiology of the United States. His research examines pleasure and displeasure responses to exercise, including their underlying cognitive and neurobiological mechanisms and their implications for exercise behavior. Personally, for me, it's a great honor to receive Professor Ekkekakis at our home. We had the opportunity yesterday to talk a little bit, to learn with him, to have some conversations. We have developed some works in the past. This is the first time I had the opportunity to interact with Professor Ekkekakis. I have learned a lot throughout the last years with the research we have shared. His research was very impactful in the way I structured my idea of exercise and how to promote exercise. And I believe that this presentation today, although not related with his main research, because it is focused on an issue, a replication crisis issue that we have in our field of work, in our field of research, is very relevant and important, mainly for young researchers, PhD students, and also for all of us that are trying to improve this process. And I believe it will be very helpful for us to think, to brainstorm around it, and hopefully you will find it as interesting as I have found in the past. And I believe that you will also consider the same of me. So, to not take any more time off the professor, once again, thank you very much. We are very pleased to have you here, and the stage is yours to do your presentation.
So, if it's okay, I'm going to walk around. I'm a teacher more than anything else, so I like to move and talk. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a tremendous honor and a great pleasure to interact with all of you, and mostly the students. So as Yogo said, I'm not going to talk about psychology very much today. I'm going to talk about exercise science and kinesiology more general. And in particular, as I'm into the third of my career, 25 years in academia, 35 years in exercise science, I have become increasingly concerned about how we do research, how we interact with the media and the public, the messages that we are putting out there, and the trust that society is putting or not putting into our communications. So I labeled my talk the ostrich effect. Ostrich, of course, is this bird here. I don't know the name in Portuguese. The ostrich effect is a term that was first presented in economics, and it refers to a cognitive bias that causes people to avoid information that they perceive as potentially unpleasant. So the replication crisis is an important problem that is happening across all areas of science. And I would argue, and I will show you today, that it is also a problem in our field, but there have been no books, there have been no conferences, there has been only a tiny number of articles, and it seems like our field is avoiding the conversation. Why? Because it is very uncomfortable, potentially unpleasant. I'm going to start from from a tweet. That's it.
You just that's your well, can you hear fine?
Okay, so I'm going to start from a tweet. This is from a very junior faculty member, somebody just starting their career. And the date is January 5th. And they had a paper accepted early in January. And the young colleague says, manuscript accepted, good start to the new year. Can't publish one paper a month if you miss the first month. So evidently, our field has managed to communicate to this junior professor that he's expected to publish one paper a month to be successful. Everything else that I will say today probably relates back to this mentality. I don't know how it started. I don't know how we got here, but we are here. So the first conversation about the replication crisis probably started with this famous 2005 article by another Greek person by the name of John Ioannidis, who runs a center on meta-science at Stanford. Meta-science is the science of how we do science. And the title was Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. And when you first read the title, I couldn't believe that he meant it literally. In fact, most published findings are false, come on. But no, he actually meant it literally. Claimed research findings may often be simply accurate measures of the prevailing bias. What does that mean? It means that if I have a certain bias, a certain belief, then if I know enough about the research process, the research methods, the statistics, I can probably make the result that I want come out. The paper was pretty mathematical, so I'm not going to bother you with mathematics, but there was an interesting series of corollaries, logical implications. And if you know enough about statistics and how the research process works, these will make sense. But as I read them, think about exercise science and whether these apply to us. The smaller the studies conducted in a scientific field, the less likely the research findings are to be true. What's wrong with small studies? Well, one thing that's clear is low statistical power. Low statistical power means higher risk of committing type 2 error, right? But in addition, small studies also means very large confidence intervals, very low precision in estimating where the means actually are, which means very low precision in comparing groups, right? Number two, the smaller the effect sizes in a scientific field, the less likely the research findings have to be true. Why? Because if you're dealing with small effect sizes, for example, the comparison of one type of exercise to another type of exercise over only, say, an 8-week period, you don't expect giant effects, you expect small effects. But if you have small effects, that means that you need what? Very large samples to have enough statistical power. The smaller the effect, the larger the sample that you need to conduct that study properly. Large samples are very difficult to find. The greater the number and the lesser the selection of tested relationships in a scientific field, the less likely the research findings are to be true. What does that mean? In exercise science, we deal with a lot of constructs that cannot be measured by one outcome. For example, glucose metabolism, or immune function, or quality of life, or executive function. You cannot measure any of those things by having one dependent variable. So then we have 10, 20, 30, 40 dependent variables, and we test each one at 0.05. If you conduct 10, 20, 30, 40 tests at 0.05, what happens? You increase the risk of false positives or type 1 errors. The greater the flexibility in designs, definitions, outcomes, and analytical modes in a scientific field, the less likely the research findings are to be true. What does that mean? It means that, in certain fields, in biology, for example, you have a cookbook. You want to analyze something, and there's a standard recipe that you have to follow. Step 1, step 2, step 3. Right? If you don't do that, then you're not going to measure your outcome. But in other fields, like ours, you can study a lot of things in a lot of very different ways. So the more you have flexibility, you allow researchers the option. You can study this way, you can study that way. The more you have flexibility, the more likely it becomes that the researcher will pick the one way that worked and just pretend that they didn't try all the other ways that didn't work. The greater the financial and other interests and prejudices in a scientific field, the less likely the research findings are to be true. Everywhere you have money or you have financial implications, bias has a way of getting into the research process. In our case, we are now at the point where we are starting to compete, for example, against pharmaceutical companies, or we have some shared interest with big food companies. So money is actually becoming an important factor in exercise research. The more money comes into the process, the more bias comes in. The hotter a scientific field with more scientific teams involved, the less likely the research findings are to be true. Do we have hot issues in exercise science? Well, I don't know what happens in Portugal, but at least in the US, every week you have competition about the least amount of exercise that is, quote, effective, right? Initially, it was, oh, you just need to do 15 minutes. Well, once that started, then it was 10, then it was 8, then it was 5. And at some point, I thought when we got to the 1 minute workout, I thought that's it. But no, it continued. And now we're down to like 3 seconds of exercise, are effective. How can you produce those results? There are ways. There are ways, and I'm going to show you what those ways are. So, is exercise science a hot field with hot questions? Yes. So I think that we satisfy all 6 of these. So how did the broader conversation start about replication crisis? It started arguably mostly in psychology with this paper. If you're in psychology, you may recognize the name Darrell Bem, famous social psychologist from a very prestigious American university called Cornell. And what Darrell Bem alleged to have found is evidence for precognition and pre-emotion. In other words, being able to tell the future. What? And he conducted 9 studies. And he found a small effect, but because he had large samples, that small effect was statistically significant. The paper was published in the most prestigious journal published by the American Psychological Association, which is the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. The editors said that because they recognized that this is very controversial, they invited 5 different, very well-known peer reviewers who were very critical, scrutinized the article, but then decided, no, it checks all the boxes. The study was well conducted. And it found, I remind you, that humans can tell the future. How was this received? Darrell Bem proved ESP. ESP is extrasensory perception. Perception outside of your senses. Extrasensory perception is real, which means science is broken, because that cannot be true. It just cannot, right? So if you can conduct 9 scientific studies that undergo the strictest level of scientific scrutiny, and yet you can get published in the most prestigious scientific journal in psychology, we have a problem. You understand? Also, around the same time in 2011, another very controversial paper was published, and the title was False Positive Psychology: How we have designed the science of psychology to produce false positive results. So in this paper, the researchers did 4 things that we do very often. Number 1, instead of having 1 dependent variable, the effect of X on Y, they had just 2 dependent variables, each tested at 0.05. When you don't control for the inflation of the type 1 error, right, you increase the type 1 error, but just 2. In exercise physiology, I remind you, we often see 50, not 2. Number 2, addition of 10 more observations per cell. So this refers to the practice of collecting data and then secretly looking at the data. Collecting data, looking at the data. And when you get close to 0.05, then you collect 10 more people just to get under, just to go to 0.048, and then you say yes, and you send the manuscript for publication. Number 3, controlling for gender or the interaction of gender with treatment when there is no good theoretical reason to look at the effect of gender. People just start looking at moderating variables without providing any real justification for starting to look at moderating variables. Number 4, dropping or not dropping one of 3 conditions. So let's say, for example, that you had an exercise, aerobic exercise intervention, a resistance exercise intervention, and a controlled intervention. When you analyze the effects across 3 groups, you find nothing. But when you remove one of the conditions and you compare A to C, you find something, and then you report significant results, pretending that you never had the second condition. If you combine these 4 very common tricks, then the risk of producing a false positive result, which is supposed to be 5%, goes to 60.7%. So as the conversation started about what kind of research are we producing, you started to see a number of different replication projects. So what were those large replication projects? They took the undergraduate book that we teach to our students about psychology, and they started looking at the studies that we put in the textbook, the college books. And they picked some studies that we've been teaching for a long time. And then a number of laboratories from around the world tried to replicate those studies. The only difference was they usually had larger samples than the original studies, but other than that, they tried to replicate the methods as closely as possible. So these are the results from one of these, the Many Labs Replication Project. The X is the original effect in the original study. The little dots that you see here are the effects from the multiple laboratories around the world that try to replicate the original study. And the circle with the confidence intervals is the average of those replications. So what you want is the X to be on top of the circle, right? And that happened in some cases. You can see here that the X is right on top of the circle, right? But in other cases, you had tremendous under or tremendous over, estimation. So the newspapers and the magazines started writing, psychology has a lot of findings that cannot be replicated. This is a more recent one. This is the open science collaboration. You have p-values on the left, effect sizes on the right. Notice, of course, that in the originally published studies, most of the p-values were under 0.05, of course, were significant. But when the researchers tried to replicate them, the p-values were all over the place, right? Some significant, all of these were significant, but all of these were not. And the effect sizes were pretty much the same. Of course, originally, all the effect sizes were positive, but then in the replication attempts, there were positive and there were negative effects. And a lot of you might be thinking, well, that's psychology, but that's not true. It's not just a problem in psychology. It's a problem everywhere. So another major area is biology. In particular, in this case, cancer biology. And this started from observations done by researchers working for pharmaceutical companies. The researchers working for pharmaceutical companies read the results coming out of university research to get ideas about drug development. But when they were trying in the pharmaceutical laboratories to replicate the academic findings, they couldn't replicate it. They could replicate like 2%. So they started wondering what is happening at universities because they appear to be producing results and publishing results that are not true. So there was a first attempt, notice that this is in Nature 2012, there was a first attempt to replicate cancer biology results. 47 of 53 studies could not be replicated. This was extended more recently. These are results published in 2021. And you can see the breakdown here. The blue is positive, the pink is mixed, and the red is negative results, meaning results that could not be replicated. This was a lot more complicated than this, because the researchers actually said that the published papers did not contain enough information to be able to replicate most of the studies. And they had to contact the authors to get more information. They had to modify the protocols to get them to work. It was impossible. Another big example, one of the most important races in medicine is the search to find a drug for Alzheimer's disease. So if you start paying attention to the news, you will notice that about every 3 months, there is a major breakthrough in the search for an Alzheimer's drug. Okay? And then you never hear anything about that drug because it usually then fails to work, especially when we go to humans. This one was an interesting case published in Science in 2012, and it was an interesting case because the major breakthrough that they found referred to a drug that was already on the market. It was a drug for cancer, but the research claimed that it is very, very effective against Alzheimer's in animals. So what happens in those cases? Because it's such an important claim, researchers around the world try to replicate the initial results. Now, as you can imagine, because this was a drug that was already on the market, this paper cost what? Everybody that had a relative with Alzheimer's went to their doctor and said, please give us the drug. So the price of the stock of the company that made the drug skyrocketed. No attempt to replicate the initial result came to. Multiple efforts, $26 million spent trying to replicate the initial findings, unable to detect any evidence of drug efficacy. We were not able to reproduce the described effects in several animal models, and so on and so on. What about fMRI research, brain activation research? So this paper was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science of the US in 2016, and they essentially discovered an error in the software. And in particular, you know, in fMRI research, because we have millions of these voxels, you need a very strong way to control for the inflation of the type 1 error. Right? Because imagine comparing voxel to voxel, voxel to voxel millions of times, your P 0.05 will go to 100%. So you need a very tight method to make sure that your false positive rate doesn't increase. So they discovered that the software that we use in fMRI studies had a bug. And in reality, in theory, we should find 5% false positive for a significance threshold of 5%, but instead, we found that the most common software packages, all of them, can result in false positive rates of up to 70%. So you know all of these colorful images that you've been seeing in the newspapers about the brain area for this was discovered for empathy, for guilt, for love. Most of these findings are actually false. This is genetic association studies. This refers to what you read in the newspapers, the gene for Down syndrome, the gene for schizophrenia, the gene for obesity. So here we have effect sizes on the y-axis, and we have the number of people tested on the x-axis. And you will see that the initial findings are very, very large. Either the gene increases the risk of a certain disease, or the gene decreases the risk of a certain disease. But then, as we collect more and more and more people, and we analyze that gene, what happens to the effect size? It goes to 1.0, which means no difference. So why is this happening? Because genetic association studies also have the problem of inflating the type 1 error rate. Why? Because they don't analyze one gene, they analyze 100,000 genes. So unless you tighten your process and you adjust all of these comparisons, you're going to inflate the type 1 error rate. And then you discover these, by chance, very large associations that then never replicate. This is from nutritional epidemiology. This refers to the things that you read in the newspapers that say eating this increases your risk of cancer, or eating that reduces the risk of cancer. So in this case, Ioannidis with another colleague took a cookbook and took all the ingredients that we use in our kitchen to cook, and then tried to see what epidemiology has told us about the association with cancer. There are some consistent results. So I'm going to tell you what they are. The red one, salt, bad for you. No doubt about it. All the studies show salt is bad for you. Pork, bad for you. Bacon, which is pork, bad for you. And then olives, good for you. Other than those, all the other ingredients that we use in our kitchen have been shown to both increase and decrease the risk of cancer. Those cannot all be true. In our field, I already alluded that we have an issue with the claims about how much physical activity is needed to have health benefits. In July of 22, the American Heart Association announced an enormous study that said that if you do, let's focus on the vigorous, 75 to 150 minutes a week of vigorous intensity physical activity, then you reduce your risk of mortality from all causes by 19%. 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous. What percentage of people does 75 minutes of vigorous intensive physical activity per week? Something like 0.06%. But that's beside the point. If you wait a few months, then you come to October 8th of 22, and now the claim was, no. You don't need 75. You can do 2 to 4 1-minute bursts. For example, you can pick up your pace to catch the bus, or you can go up a flight of stairs. And if you do that, then you reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease death by half, and death from cancer by 40%. And if you do 11 little bouts, so you sprint, pick up the pace 11 times a day, at least a minute every time, then your risk from cardiovascular disease death goes down by 65%, and risk of death by cancer goes down by half. Are these numbers likely to be true? If they are, then everything we've been telling people based on all of the epidemiological evidence that we've had all of these decades, those are lies then. So not all of these can be true at the same time. So this is the situation that we have now. We have been telling people things that appear in all areas of research, telling people things that don't appear to be true. So you know how sometimes we say, trust science, believe in science. There isn't just one kind of science. And not all kinds of science are believable. That's a huge problem for society. We cannot be telling people things that are false, right? So there is a revolution. There's no doubt about it. For the first time, people are concerned. A manifesto for reproducible science. How can we do science better? A push to redefine statistical significance from 0.05 to 0.005. Make it a lot more difficult to label a result as statistically significant. Or a push to get rid of p-values altogether and move to an entirely different way of reaching conclusions about what worked and what doesn't. So this is happening for the first time. So I want to show you now a little bit from our own field. Where are these false findings coming from? They're coming from a variety of different sources. One is misconduct, people deliberately manipulating their data and their analyses. There is incompetence. There are conflicts of interest that are becoming more significant. And then what I call questionable research practices, things that we kind of know we shouldn't be doing, but they're so common, everybody does it. Either because they don't know or because they don't think that that is a big problem. So let's start with scientific misconduct. So what is scientific misconduct? Making up data, fabrication, changing the data, falsification, and plagiarism. Let's start with fabrication. So I want to play a little video. So this was a professor of mine who was working with kids with developmental disabilities. And he had a grant collaborating with another colleague. Finding kids with developmental disabilities to test was very hard. And yet the colleague was collecting a lot of data very quickly and very easily. So he became concerned that the colleague was probably making up the data. And in fact, that was the case. The colleague was making up the data. So then he went to the funding agency. In the US, that's the National Institute of Health, and said, I suspect that my colleague is making up the data. What happened? The National Institute of Health turned against him because they thought if this gets out, then the politicians will cut our funding. So they cut his funding instead of the guy that was making up. He fought for more than 10 years. And what I'm going to play is when finally the truth was established, he was called to testify at the US Congress. Because of this story, this is an exercise science story. Because of this story, the US established the Office of Research Integrity, independent of the National Institute of Health, so that people could feel more safe going to say that somebody's making up data without being afraid that the NIH would cut their funding. So listen to the one particular portion.
In some cases where fraud or misconduct had been uncovered, the guilty scientists had an amazing number of publications, more than a dozen articles each year. Is it possible to publish that many articles of high quality in your experience?
It's very difficult to publish good articles, high quality articles, to do the work and also get the book. I don't think it's possible. I think that's one of the first signs that there's really something possibly remiss when you get those extremely high publication rates.
This was 1988. And in the minds of the scientists who were working at the time, if you publish 12 papers a year, there's a good chance you're making up the deal. Or something is going wrong. Fast forward to 2023, and we now believe that you're expected to publish 12 articles. You see the shift in mentality in a short period of time, in one academic generation. I teach a class on critical appraisal. I teach particularly students who want to go into medicine or physical therapy, how to critically analyze articles. And one exercise we do is that I ask them to find a meta-analysis and then redo it. Go back to the original articles, put the numbers into the software, and see if they get the same result. Okay? So one of the student comes to me and says, I need some help because I found this meta-analysis and I found the articles. And it doesn't make any sense. So of course, lots of students are confused, they haven't done this before. And I think to myself, they probably need some help. It starts to show me the problems. The meta-analysis was about exercise and chronic kidney failure. And the papers had nothing to do with the question, were completely irrelevant. So this that I have here is the effects of exercise in hypertension, which is the biggest problem in kidney disease. Most of the articles were not about kidney disease or hypertension. Almost none, I think maybe one, but almost none of these numbers were real numbers. They were completely made up. Completely. So we analyzed everything, article by article, did screenshots, and then we tried to contact the journal. The journal is called Biomed Research International, which is a Hindawi journal, and they charge $2,400 to publish it. So we try to find the editor. There is no editor listed. We try to find a contact email. There is no contact email listed. So the only thing that we were able to find after days of looking was a general Hindawi email address about ethics. And I emailed my analysis, 20 pages, to the ethics person. This is the ethics person, Matt Hutchinson. Thank you for flagging this up, Hattie. The research integrity team has received your email to publication ethics at Hindawi. They will assess the issue and consult the relevant section editor and discuss with me if necessary. I have committed to post this on Twitter every year that the issue remains unresolved. In 2021, thanks for flagging this up. We are aware of the issue and the investigation is ongoing. This was from 2022. Thank you for raising this concern. We're investigating. My wife says the answers are getting shorter and shorter. And at some point, they're going to say, F you. So what happened? The guy, the ethics person, now is the general research integrity manager for the entire United Kingdom. And Hindawi was acquired by Wiley for $300 million. To this day, the fake, completely fake meta-analysis is receiving citations as being a valid piece of work. So why is this happening? You might have noticed that this was a Chinese study. So in China, the government had a policy, if you publish in an English journal, you get paid money. How much? From $30 to $165,000 if you publish in Science and Nature. More recently, they claim that they have now stopped this policy. Evidence suggests that the focus on metrics has also driven a rise in inappropriate practices, such as researchers submitting plagiarized or fraudulent papers or inappropriately citing their own or a colleague's work with those citations. If you go online today, with a little skill, you will find articles that are available for sale. Meaning that if you pay money, they will add your name as a core. So let's look at exercise a little bit more closely. This was in the news a couple of years ago. Exercise science grad student at Australian University dismissed after he admitted faking data, says the supervisor. And the backstory here was PhD student went to study with a professor that was famous, rising star, and the grad student felt that he needed to live up to those expectations. And an easy way to live up to those expectations for the student was to start making up. So now you have a series of articles that had to be identified and retracted. We were discussing last night about some articles from Brazil that were discovered. So this is one of the articles that was found to be fake. You can be looking at this table for a long time without seeing, right? Because unless you get into the mindset that what you're looking at is possibly fabricated, then you will never see it. If I tell you that this is fabricated, now you start looking at the numbers very different. So if you look at it for maybe 10 minutes, at some point, you're going to see, for example, an average number of 187 with a standard deviation of 2. And it's not really possible to have a mean of 187 with a standard deviation of 2, right? This is extremely, narrow standard deviation for a mean this high. So this is how the fraud was discovered in this case, by how unlikely it is to find numbers like that. So then you go again into the process of trying to find all the fake articles and remove them from the literature. Same lab. Interval training may shed more pounds than a continuous moderate intensity workout, suggests a full analysis published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine that I hear likes to reject articles without review. You would agree that this is an attractive finding, right? We found a more effective way of exercising that makes you lose more weight. So of course it's going to make the news. This was in Runner's World, this was in a lot of publications that people read. So this was the main result. This is total body fat in kilograms. Again, you can look at this and never think something might be off until I tell you that something is off. And then you will notice things like, look at the diamond at the bottom. What do you see? You see the vertical line, and you see that the diamond just misses the vertical line by a hair. Look at the confidence interval, 0.05. So just misses the 0 line. What does that tell you? It tells you that the tiniest error, the tiniest discrepancy would have made this result nonsense. And therefore, no headlines, no worldwide media, no interviews, no fame. Once you realize that, then you have to take another look at it and ask yourself, this is a comparison between HIIT and moderate intensity exercise, not HIIT and nothing. These are two alternative types of exercise. And you're going to tell me that there was a 13 kilogram difference in fat loss from two alternative types of exercise in usually a very short training period. So let's look at this Thomas 1984 paper. It's not easy to find because it's from 1984. It's not digitized. So I had to go to the basement of the library to find it. And you realize the article doesn't have any data on total body fat at all. It did have data on percentage of body fat, but the differences were tiny, and of course, the error bars were huge. So this is not 13 kilograms of difference under any circumstance. So you realize that the meta-analysis was fake. The authors were apt to explain how they got the results. So it was retracted. This is from motor control. Irregularities in articles that had to do with implicit learning or implicit learning. How did they realize something was wrong? Because they were supposed to be different samples, but somehow the ages were identical. So 1048, standard deviation of 0.9, 1048, standard deviation of 0.9. Now you know that something is problematic, right? So now you're going to look at the articles differently. Here's a table. You can look at the table for a long, long time. Let me test you. You see the problem? I showed you an identical deviation. I showed you an identical example before, right? So now, you know what this comparison is? An effect size of 3,500. Right? You would never have seen it until I told you that this is a problematic article. And then you started looking, right? Then you started looking. What about falsification? What is falsification? Changing the data to conform to your expectations. So here again, we had arguably one of the most famous cases in the world, because this was the first scientist in the US, an exercise physiologist, that went to jail. Up until this case, the punishment for making up stuff was simply to not allow you to submit an application to get government funding for 3 years. That was the punishment. This was the first case where he went to jail and actually did 1 year in jail. So what was this case? The guy hires a new postdoc. They were looking at the effects of exercise, I think, on blood pressure in older women. Gives a USB drive to the postdoc and says, go analyze the data. The postdoc comes back the next day and says, no effect. And the guy goes, oh, sorry, I gave you the wrong data. Takes the USB drive back, gives it to the postdoc again the next day. Postdoc analyzes, finds P less than 0.05, becomes suspicious, starts looking at the numbers and realizes that overnight the professor started flipping the numbers from the experimental to the control, the experimental to the control, until he got 0.05. Obesity expert owes up to $1 million crime. In fact, it wasn't $1 million crime, it was many millions of dollars, that because he was faking data his entire career. This is from Science. Researcher faces prison, in fact, was in prison. This is in a letter that he wrote to the judge to ask for a linear, more lenient sentence. I was motivated by my own desire to advance as a respected scientist. More recently, we had a case in Denmark. An up-and-coming rising star was essentially found to, in this case, falsify images, not number, but images. So you can see here that we're looking at interleukin 6 in skeletal muscle, and then we have another paper using or focusing on another thing, metallothionein. A researcher from the UK who was following these publications saw, I don't have the talent to see the similarities, but there are people that are very visual, and saw that this slice kind of reminded me of that slice. So it took me a while to do this, this trick, so bear with me. So this is supposedly, I think, IL-6 from one paper. And this is the metallothionein from another paper, and essentially it's the same slide, pretending to be something else, right? This is another one. You see it? And it wasn't, of course, just that. This was retracted because the images were being reused, supposedly to show different things across different papers. This is interleukin 8 in one publication and interleukin 6 in another publication. You ready? These are the slides from the first paper. These are the slides from another paper, supposedly showing another interleukin. And down here, the same thing, just playing around in Photoshop with the exposure and the contrast to make it seem it's different. So this was retracted. I'm not showing you, of course, all the examples. So the outcome was, in an unprecedented case, never before in history, the University of Copenhagen took away her doctoral degree. That's why I'm telling you, I've said now the first time, and it's all kinesiology, exercise science based. So we are leading this problem, right? We are among the most important troublemakers. Plagiarism. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I'm going to mention it because there was again a worldwide scandal very recently. And it was the guy who is in charge of the concussion committee for all the international sport organizations, football and so forth, rugby, all the sports that are concerned about concussion. He was in charge of that worldwide organization, very famous, 36,000 citations, 230 pages, and so forth. So people started noticing problems. So it started with self-plagiarism. He was copying himself, copy, paste, to be able to produce more papers. The medical literature clearly describes many causes of delayed cerebral deterioration. Other paper. The medical literature clearly describes many causes of delayed cerebral deterioration. He was copying and pasting across papers. But of course, if you do self-plagiarism, at some point you're going to do other plagiarism. So this was his paper, supposedly, in this cohort of 821 individuals who had suffered a head trauma. And this is a paper by others. In this cohort of 821 individuals who suffered head trauma between. So he was doing this forever. That's how he got up to 200 plus publications. Look, this is in the news. This is big stuff, right? Plagiarism scandal puts renowned concussions doctor under scrutiny. And soon thereafter, he had to resign from this group, the Concussion in Sport Group, which is funded by governing bodies, including the International Olympic Committee, FIFA, and World Rugby. Let's come to another major issue that we are now experiencing, and that is conflicts of interest. So those of you who pay close attention to these things, you might remember some years ago that an organization was formed suddenly, and it was called the Global Energy Balance Network. It was on all social media, people were giving interviews, and the face of the Global Energy Balance Network was, anybody know? Steve Blair. So listen carefully to the statements that I'm going to play.
In the popular media and in the scientific press is about eating too much, blaming fast food, blaming sugary drinks, and so on. And there's really virtually no compelling evidence that that in fact is the cause.
Eating too much, there's no evidence that that contributes to obesity, but perhaps more specifically, sugary drinks. There's no evidence that sugary drinks lead to obesity. Let it sink in. Because this is Steve Blair. A lot of us got into exercise science because of Steve. we looked up to Steve. So how did that whole story unfold? Well, there were signs. For example, at one point, we started seeing publications like this. Declining trends in energy expenditure explain the obesity epidemic. People become obese only because they are physically inactive. That is the only problem. And you can see here, some individuals may be persuaded to restrict their caloric consumption in the short term, but that's unlikely to sustain it, especially at low levels of energy expenditure. Increasing energy expenditure, therefore, is the key. So, a little known company called Coca-Cola realized that this could be an important strategy for them. So they got together with some professors, including Steve Blair, and they developed a triple plan. The energy balance network was one part of the process. Exercises medicine was a second part of the process. And a global study of children's physical activity called ISCO was the third part of the process. So I want to show you a little bit of how the story broke. So there was one study in particular that got some people very, very upset. Less housework may be the leading to weight issues in women. To put it less kindly, women get fat because they don't work in the home as much as they used to. How can you say that? Well, there are time use data that they analyzed, where women from the United States were asked how they spend their day. These are longitudinal data. And they found that women, in fact, spend less time doing household chores, probably because we have machines now. But the conclusion was, read carefully. These results suggest that the decrement in household management energy expenditure may have contributed to the increasing prevalence of obesity in women during the last 5 decades. This growing body of research suggests that the rise in body weight and obesity may be due to decreases in physical activity. What? Alone. That's the key word. That's the key word. And then you go to the end of the paper and they say, all of us in this paper received money from the Coca-Cola. So what was the next step? Investigative researchers from the New York Times did something very simple. You can look up where the server for the Global Energy Balance Network was. You can do that. Those of you who know about computers know how to do that. And that server resided on the same server as Coca-Cola.com, Coke.com, and so forth. So, August 9, 2015, the New York Times come out and they say, major scandal. These people that have been telling you about physical activity were in fact paid under the table secretly by the Coca-Cola company. This was on all the major newspapers, all the television shows. It was an unprecedented scandal in the United States. This is the lady from Coca-Cola that conceived the plan and was leading all of these things. The Global Energy Balance Network immediately disappeared. Research group funded by Coca-Cola to disband. So now we go to the second one, which was exercise is medicine, which was the second part of the plan. Coca-Cola conceived exercise is medicine as part of the same marketing strategy. And the idea was, again, through exercise is medicine, to convince all the physicians to stop emphasizing nutritional habits and begin emphasizing physical activity. Coca-Cola was the founding partner. After the scandal with the Global Energy Balance Network, immediately ACSM discontinued their collaboration with Coca-Cola, and Exercises Medicine disappeared from the Coca-Cola website. But if you know about computers, you can still go back and find all of the campaigns promoting Exercises Medicine. The third part of the strategy, which was also now been discontinued, was a global study of children's physical activity called ISCO. As you can see here, they attracted a lot of our colleagues, a lot of our good colleagues, because they promised them hundreds of thousands of dollars, and in fact, essentially unlimited funding. So far, we have one major study come out, and I'm going to show you what Coca-Cola got out of that. So read the conclusions from that study. Behavioral risk factors are important correlates of obesity in children, particularly low, moderate to vigorous physical activity, short sleep duration, and high TV viewing period. Anything missing from that statement that you noticed? Maybe nothing about nutrition and sugar. You understand? Coca-Cola paid an unknown amount of money, but it's certainly in the neighborhood of $3 to $5 million for this center. In the US, there's something called the Freedom of Information Act. So I can submit a one-page request to any government entity, including state universities, and I can say, give me all of your internal documents and internal emails, all of them. And unfortunately, the university has to do it. So you can now go to several journals of public health, and you can read all the internal emails going on between Coca-Cola and the researchers. This is the lady, Rona Applebaum, that I told you was the mastermind of this entire thing, celebrating the publication of the study. A very happy day, a glorious day. I raise my glass to the researchers and the ISCO staff. Let's now switch mindsets a little bit from the bad behaviors and talk a little bit about things we do every day without really knowing that we are doing anything problematic. So in the last few years, we have started using terms that we were not using before, right? P-hacking, that's a new thing. Arcing or hypothesizing after the results are known, that's a new word. So there was this interesting study, actual study, this is not fake, that was published, and it made the news worldwide because it basically said if you eat chocolate, you can lose weight more quickly. Don't say yes because it's not true.
I was going to say yay.
Yay. So this was all by design. The study was actually done, but it was done to prove up. And I'll tell you what the point is. So this is the study published in 2015. It was a tiny study published in not a good journal, but that's irrelevant. And in fact, they claim that the effect of the chocolate, the so-called weight loss turbo, seems to go hand in hand with personal well-being, blah, 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 and people lost more weight. So I want you to notice something about the study. First of all, a tiny number of subjects, 5 and 4, right? And then I'm showing you only some of the dependent variables. The list was actually much longer. After the study made the news all around the world, the researcher, who was in fact a science journalist with a PhD, came out and said, I told you. And wrote an article in Gizmodo, you can go read it. Here's a dirty little science. If you're a PhD student, this is how you become famous. So listen closely. If you measure a large number of things, in other words, if you have many dependent variables, about a small number of people, if you have a tiny sample, you are almost guaranteed to get a statistically significant result. Our study included 18 different measurements: weight, cholesterol, sodium, blood protein, sleep quality, from 15 people. 18 variables, 15 people. That study design is a recipe for false positives. What do you get from a small sample? Why is a small sample, if you're trying to find something, like that, chocolate helps you lose weight? Why is a small sample a great thing to have? Remember the confidence intervals, right? The smaller the sample, the less precise your estimates of the true value, the larger your confidence. So now the mean can bounce at random, basically, anywhere along that very large confidence. Then, if you have many, many different things that you study, and you study all of them at 0.05, something will come out. It always does. So then you fixate on that one thing, and you say, aha, major discovery. And you can find anything you want. Let me show you some examples. This was a very famous demonstration of this in the MRI literature. They took a dead salmon and they put the dead salmon in an fMRI machine, and they started showing the dead salmon images. One mature Atlantic salmon participated in the fMRI study. The salmon perished, and it was not alive at the time of scan. It is not known if the salmon was male or female, but given the post-mortem state of the subject, this was not thought to be a critical variable. The task administered to the salmon involved completing an open-ended mentalizing task. The salmon was shown a series of photographs depicting human individuals in social situations with a specified emotional valence, either socially inclusive or socially exclusive. They followed the typical fMRI analysis, and they found that the salmon's brain showed activation. Of course, this was meant to prove the same point. If you're not careful about controlling your false positive rate, your type 1 error rate, you're going to find things that seem impressive, but are not true. Remind me the recipe. What's the recipe? What do I need? 2 ingredients, tiny samples, and lots of dependent variables. So here are some great discoveries that you also can make if you follow the recipe. 4-second workouts can counteract sitting all day. You sit for 8 hours, but if you get up for 4 seconds and do this and sit down again, you're gonna be healthy. Stronger muscles in 3 seconds a day. This didn't involve any weights. It's just that you stop typing and you flex your bicep for 3 seconds and your strength goes up. And you can also cure cancer. 1 session of HIIT helps stop cancer cells from growing. How can you make these discoveries? Tiny samples, long list of dependent variables. So let's look at the studies. The first one, 8 participants. You know what 8 participants means? If you're trying to investigate a small effect, and I would imagine that we're looking at what a small effect, 7.8% statistical power. How much is supposed to be? Statistical power is supposed to be 80%. And look at some of the dependent variables, not all of them, just some of them. All of them with asterisks. You see the asterisk? That means that all of them were investigated at 0.05. How about the getting stronger by flexing your biceps for 3 seconds? Here we have sample sizes of 13 and 10. That's a power of 7.4. And these are only some of the dependent variables. How about curing cancer? How can you do that? 10 participants and lots of dependent variables investigated at 0.05. These are different types of cancer cells, all of them tested at 0.05. You understand the mechanics here? Yes? So I want the students to remember, unless you do something to control the inflation of the type 1 error rate, it's going to rise like this. This is the formula. It's called the CIDEFES formula. If you do 5 tests, the risk of a false positive goes to 23%. If you do 14 tests, it goes to 51%. If you do 50 tests, it goes to 95%. This assumes that the tests are independent of each other, but even if they are correlated, so here I have correlation of 0.3, 0.5, and 0.7, you can still see that the risk of a type 1 error, for example, this is from an actual exercise physiology study, 41 dependent variables, at best, even if all the variables are correlated very highly, at best, you're talking about a 67% risk of committing a type. I have a quiz. What is the meaning of P, the p-value? There is less than 5% probability that the null hypothesis is true. Or, to say differently, there is more than 95% probability that the alternative hypothesis is true. If another sample were to be drawn at random from the same population, there is more than 95% probability that you're going to get the same result. In other words, high probability of replication. There is less than 5% probability of making a type 1 error. Or there is more than 95% probability that the observed effect was not due to chance or all of the above. How should we interpret a p-value?
Can say B, but maybe all of the above are also a trick question.
What is it?
It's a trick question.
It is a trick question. And what's the right answer?
That you're going to give the next slide.
Which is none of them are true. None of them are true. So what is the meaning of a p-value? A p-value tells you the probability of obtaining a statistical result, say a t-test or an f-test, that is more extreme than the one you obtain, assuming that the null hypothesis is true, meaning that there are no differences or no association with the variable. We assume that the null hypothesis is true. So you can think of it, if you have a little bit of a mathematical thinking, it's the probability of obtaining the statistical result, assuming that the null hypothesis is true, not the probability of the null given the data. Those are not the same statements. They are very different statements. So very quickly, does the p-value say anything about the options that I showed you? Yes, kind of. We can estimate, but nothing like what we were assuming. For example, does the p-value say anything about the null hypothesis? Yes, but you know what a p of 0.05 means? It means 52% probability that the null hypothesis is false. 50-50. Let me say it again. A p-value of 0.05 doesn't tell you whether there is or there isn't a difference. There is only a 50% probability, not 5 or 95. How about replication? We can estimate again, but a p of 0.05 only means a 50% probability that if you were to draw an identical sample and did an identical experiment, you would get the same result. 50%. How about the risk of making a type 1 error? If you get a 0.05, what are the probabilities that you will make a type 1 error? 29%. At least 28.9% of p-values near 0.05 can be expected to come from studies in which the null hypothesis is true. So we have had this wrong the entire time. I'm going to skip a little bit, and by a little I mean a lot. And I'm going to come to this. I was a peer reviewer for an article, and I could tell that it was from a friend that I knew. It was in my area, but not in the friend's area. So very, very kindly and very, very politely, I explained, unfortunately, you haven't done this right, and here are sources and references, and you can look it up that you made some mistake. They take the manuscript, submit it to another journal, it gets published, and of course the friend knew that it was me that reviewed the article, and she sends me an email that says, we got it into an SSC. So. In other words, the game is not to publish anything correct. The game is to be published in MSSC. That's the game. That's how we understand it. Is to find reviewers who don't know enough to say, yes, this is okay, and to publish it in high-profile journals. So for the student out there, you need to think, what kind of science do you want to do? And what kind of scientist do you want to be? And if you want to be the scientist that produces replicable results that will stand the test of replication and the test of time, then I think you know what. So what do we need to do as leaders in exercise science? Acknowledge that we have a problem. So far we haven't. That's the first step. Radically reconsider the criteria by which we evaluate and reward research scholarship performance. The whole notion of expecting 12 publications from a junior colleague, this is not a recipe for good science. Abolish quantity over quality. Cultivate, encourage, and celebrate critical analysis. What I told you today, a much kinder, softer, gentler form. We tried to publish in a paper. We were rejected by 8 large journals in exercise science. They didn't want to hear it. We don't want to hear that we have a problem. Take peer reviewing extremely seriously. Look at the numbers closely. Don't skip the tables. Look at the tables. Dramatically improve the quality of our statistical education. We need to understand at least what a p-value is. We need to understand what type 1 and type 2 errors are. We need to understand statistical power. Vigorously promote replication, openness, and transparency. And then finally, reflect about what are we doing as a field? What future do we want to have? What credibility with society we want to have? Thank you, and I appreciate your opinion.
Thank you, Professor Ekkekakis, for your presentation. I believe that all of us are now thinking about our practices, and hopefully this will help us in the future to think what we are doing and where we want to go. Now, we have time for 1 or 2 questions before the next intervention. Probably some of you would like to question some of the ideas that were presented by Professor. You now have that opportunity. If you'd like, I can change my extend the barrier, so I can try to translate.
There are several experienced researchers here, several PhD students, several young researchers, several professionals in the field. That's, I believe, all of you face the issue of reading and interpreting science and the papers that are published. I surely find often the difficulty to interpret some of the results that other colleagues publish. Thank you very much.
We talked a lot about the pre-value now, regarding the question of research practices, but what would be other questionable research practices that you can manage with another business?
The ones I skipped. So there are so many, and it's research methods related and statistically related. So in terms of statistics, what I tell my students is, you know, I give them the task of finding problems in publishers. And I tell them, I can almost guarantee you that in this one area, you're going to find a problem, and that is statistical power. Okay. And there are all kinds of tricks, and now I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to give you an example. Of course, now I can. This. So this is published in the Journal of Sports Sciences that has a statistical editor. Okay, it's one of the few journals in our field that have a person entirely dedicated to testing the statistics. So this was a comparison again, of course, between HIIT and moderate intensity exercise, effect size of 0.4, power of 80%, alpha 0.05, and they say we need 12 people. You see, 80% power, alpha of 0.05, effect size of 0.4. Anybody see a problem? Small. So you need to train your gut. This is a, this is a gut, a visceral sensation. When you see a less than medium effect, and there's a claim that 12 people is enough, you should immediately feel your stomach going like this, right? Because what is it in reality? So this is effect size of 0.4, alpha of 0.05, power of 0.8, you need 100 and 100, total 200. Not 12. You understand? So that's another major example in statistical power. Why is this happening? Why do we have all of this problem? Because it's very difficult to get 200 people to run your study when you're doing a thesis or a dissertation, right? So how much do we get with 12? 12 and 12, 15% power, not 8, 15%. That means what? That means that the risk of committing a type 2 error is 85. One example.
Maybe one question is, because the question is, when did you start being concerned about the quality not only of your research, but the quality of others? Because it was something that is always with you, or did you develop it? And maybe how can we as a research community develop this sense of okay, we need to do the right stuff, and we need to be aware of the right stuff?
So I think in psychology, there is more concern about methods and statistics than in other disciplines. I think since I was a student, I was curious about how we do research. And then I started becoming really concerned when I started seeing claims that seemed extreme. And I knew enough to start looking at the methods and the stats. And I started seeing things like that. More and more and more and more. And then is nobody looking? Is nobody checking? What are the editors doing? What are the peer reviewers doing? What is happening? And honestly, as I'm getting older, I'm concerned about the field. Because this whole thing about you just need to do 3 seconds. Everybody else is wrong. If anybody's telling you need to do 150 minutes, they don't know what it is. You just need to do 3 seconds. This is a recipe for very, very problematic results in the future. So that is why I'm passionate, because I think we're going to lose our credibility. You know, COVID taught us a lot of things about the credibility of science and how protective we should be of the credibility of science. And we're not on a good path.
So we have time for one last question. Our colleague Marta wants to ask something.
So I have lots of comments that I will use my time in wrong able to read, but first I want to just say thank you for the talk, really useful. Just a quick question. What are you currently doing within your university in terms of bringing open science and practices to courses for researchers, PhD students? Just interested in how we can also learn from other people in terms of providing regulation and courses and training in that area.
So there are many different dimensions here. One is how we train the students across from an undergraduate to doctoral. And then another, as I alluded to, is how we evaluate our junior faculty, junior colleagues. So I'm trying to address all of these. When I was a professor, I tried to integrate critical appraisal from the undergraduate to the doctoral level. So at the undergraduate level, as part of my exercise psychology class, I had an evidence-based practice project that was running in parallel to the main course the entire semester. And it basically was asking the students to identify 3 randomized control trials in which physical activity was the independent variable, and then a mental health variable was the dependent variable, or the other way around. And I had 2 or 3 class sessions in which I taught them the basics of how we try to critique. Of course, it's at the undergraduate level, so you don't expect miracles. Then I have a class that both senior 4-year students can take and graduate students can take. And it is essentially a more advanced version of that. That's the class that I mentioned, in which we have 2 major projects. One is to redo a published meta-analysis, and the second, which is the final project, is to scrutinize a published randomized control trial, the entire thing, from samples to procedures to analysis to interpretation. And then we decided as a faculty that one course in research methods at the graduate level was not enough, because we were teaching all of this to the grad students when they were starting, and then when they were ready to do their dissertation, they would come back and say, how many participants should I have? You took tests on this one, right? You know how to do it. So it wasn't registered. So we thought we're going to do a second level PhD course in research methods, focusing on openness, transparency, and interpretation. So I teach them all of these mechanics. I teach them about transparent and open science practices, and then hope for the best. What ends up happening, if I'm being honest, is that I teach them all of these things. Their eyes go like this. Wow, Dr. E, we had no idea. Then they go to their professors in physiology or biomechanics. They say, Ekkekakis is crazy, doesn't know what he's talking about. You are going to use 6 participants. So that's the problem.
Okay, so thank you, Professor. Thank you, Marta, for your question. We will now take a 5-minute break to break student behavior. We have a flexible schedule. So within 5 minutes, we will start off. After 5 minutes, we will start the next session. Okay. Thank you, Professor, once again.
Ricardo, o que é que achou?
Vou tentar divulgar, mas a gravação não vai ficar muito boa. Porque eu fiz no truque. E para ali.
O microfone está aqui.
Esse grupo de baralhar.
Ainda pensei, vou pôr o microfone à frente. Não sei como é que vai ser. Como é que vai.
Põe a pé da sua placa, para não baralhar isso.
Não quero ser daqui. Vai, cara, fiz mais.
Não, professor. Dizer a foto de vida, passa de sinal que eu desligo.
Sente-se mais cá à frente. Aqui estamos
Eu gosto de saber que sim.
Não foi possível para final.
Estamos todos ao preço, digamos, aqui apanha mais gente.
Boa tarde.
Combinei com
não sabemos, então é uma das nossas celebridades, é um professor que está aqui na sala lá.
Ah, pronto, está bem.
Sim, não, está aqui, está ali na sala lá. Porque quando cheguei, houve uma aluna que entrou na sala lá e eu reconheci o professor. Estou a andar. Muito obrigada pelo convite.
Se calhar podemos expor. Se temos esta, se nós queremos mais assim. Não, ao contrário, espera aí, estou a pensar ao contrário. Pois era ao contrário. Não estás a falar.
Uma cidade geométrica.
Se fizermos assim,
Ah,
pelo menos sempre nos vemos um bocadinho.
bocadinho de ângulo. Para poder fazer aquelas trocas de olhares. É uma tentativa. Pronto, você já consegue ver o professor Fernandes e a Marta e sim, ficam mais. Acho que é muita coisa para um bocadinho como estava a estar, mas para esta gente, mas a mensagem estava lá com uma diferença da achada, né? 17, muito suportável, né? Mais 17 exemplos para cada uma das coisas. Agora, pronto, já tem. Sim, agora me permite iniciar e ter um bocadinho esta ideia. Às vezes, quando nós temos hoje visto, não é só para dar trabalho, isso é que nós temos uma certa certeza, uma certa clareza e transparência para se encontrar. Temos que ter respostas de fé e doença, assim, não sei. Agora tens isto. Embora uma instituição europeia, conhecida com esta instituição, porque nós temos que estar aqui. O que é que isso permite? Que seja mais fácil. Fica 100% guardado, é um sítio que é open. Alguém pode dizer e é mais fácil. Não é preciso lá depender de mas estas das duas circulares têm dado conta. É porque aí você tem que dizer, vou buscar estes cheios, e depois há algumas dados que são. É que acho que há um autor a participar, ir ver e pensar, mas espera aí, não foi isto que eu fiz. Porque 13 quilos, eu posso trazer 13 quilos, a média, tem média. Vamos agora cá para sempre nos ajudar. Vou tornar a semana. Uma sala para trabalhar com a Ekkekakis porque eu queria trabalhar um bocadinho connosco no seguinte almoço. Se quiser, não, vai ter melhor. E lá e vai já classe, pedimos uma sala com retenção. À sexta-feira é que eu estou a falar. Vou dar sinal para entrar. We then once we ask this part, let's look at your policy. They categorize average and low risk. If you were, I require. We're calling that bad, but if you say, when I was 50,000, that's fine. If you are, it works. If you are an average, you have to pay 100,000 per year. Everything has a price. And everything can I said, we're not working here. We're not parking here. So maybe that's another. Sorry, I don't know if it's maybe like that or something related to that. So somehow I was asked to serve with have the first meeting. Give them a seat with a chair. No, but they have this first meeting, then starts out as recently treated by surgery and the only role that the bank has is to maintain muscle mass because there is a loss of muscle mass
medical treatments. So we're going to write with that focus. It's a big thing. You don't know what the conflicts of interest are.
Era para nós nos vermos.
Dar um breve.
Foi a mesa bicuda.
Estamos bem.
Pode pôr isto aqui ao caçador dos ordinários.
Ah, obrigado. Eu tenho que
Mas nossas não são capazes de ler agora.
eu já não escrevo, porque já sei que já estou tão mal, já nem escrevo. So if you agree, let's try to have maybe 1 hour of discussion instead of 1 hour and a half. So we are gathered here in this almost round table. It's moving into a round table. We try to do some more angular table at least so that we can see each other. And I'm really glad to be trying to moderate this session. The idea is to have a very lively discussion with you and not within ourselves, but to learn from your questions and experiences and see what kind of things emerge from the topic that we are discussing. And we are going to discuss the same topic as the presentation that you just witnessed. The idea then is each one of us will do a short comment about our positioning about this topic, and then I will try again to moderate, so please make any questions and we will try to move on depending on those questions. So there's not a real a clear script or idea about how this is going to happen. So, and having said that, I think you have learned already about Professor Ekkekakis' position, but I will still ask him to do a 2 minutes, 3 minutes summary of that. But I will first start with my other colleagues to do this and to do this presentation. So, Professor Marta Marques, she's in Universidade Nova in Lisbon, and she's worked with us in several projects. So she's also very a representative of the open science in Europe. And so she will do a little bit of talking about this. And Professor Fernandes is from the University of Porto, the FADEU, so the Faculty of Sports in Porto. And I'm António Palmeira. So, but I will first ask Marta, if you can, and then Professor Ricardo, and then Professor Ekkekakis to do this.
Hi, everyone. I was just saying I was writing some notes that I can't read anymore, so I'll just have to go with what I have in my mind. No, I just want in 2 minutes, and please tell me to stop talking if I continue, just to talk about the open science aspect, because I know you alluded to that, of course, but kind of the focus was a bit more on other stuff in terms of practices. But I do think that when we talk about how we can replicate results, how can we improve the way science is done, and you spoke, of course, about, you know, looking at databases that already exist, previous study, analyze them, replicate them, see what comes up, see the issues, improve them, etc. This all speaks to the open science opportunities that we have. And I think that a few years ago, I think there was a lot of misconduct in research that was, of course, done on purpose. You know, that is always going to happen. And I hope that we can, you know, have the level of scrutiny of things nowadays that can help us reduce that. But I think there was also a high level of misconduct because people didn't know how to do better and didn't know about these practices, didn't know about the issues that they could have. And I think that open science also helps in understanding how we can do better research. And there has been an increase. We have the Open Science Framework and the Center for Open Science that I hope that many of you have heard about. And I suppose that, yes, as part of being the research community, that I think it has two important levels. One is that it requires that everything that we do is open to the scientific community and to other people that want to look at our studies. You need to pre-register your protocols. You need to pre-register your data analysis. You need to also have all of your databases attached and added to the projects that you build as part of these platforms. You need to indicate everything that is a deviation from that, why it happened, what was the reason, how you led with that. And when you do that, you are, of course, open to receive any form of criticism or improvements in what was your research. And if anything in your research didn't go as planned, or if the way you analyze data wasn't the way that it should be done, then you have other people that can help you improve that. And it also brings another advantage, and I think for me that's the second point, is that the more you put everything that you want to do out there available, and you have this quality monitoring of what you're doing, the more you can also collaborate with other people to improve the way science is done. And I think that's a huge advantage. And I'm not entirely sure what is happening in most of the exercise sports science journals, but at least in psychology and in health psychology, which is my main field, most of the journals now require that everything that we do is pre-registered, that everything that we publish based on databases, the databases need to be provided. All the analysis we did, the scripts, the softwares, everything needs to be open, unless you have a reason to protect that, which happens a lot when you're doing, for example, research in digital platforms, but then you need to justify that and you need to provide access to that. So these are my main comments for now.
Thank you.
Boa tarde a todos. So first of all, I want to present the academic and personal greetings of Professor António Fonseca, that is the director of my faculty and the director of Research Center. So it's a big pleasure to be here. We are only 3 hours by car or by train, so it's very, very, very nice to be here. I'm not anymore a junior researcher. I'm making the transfer so slowly, getting there. But for us, networking is fundamental. So it's really very nice to be here with you. Having said that, just to make it clear, because maybe you don't know so well our research center, we have 5 subgroups, but we are working mainly in 2 big areas. On biophysics, that is the confluence between physiology and biomechanics. So we are worried about studying health research topics and also training performance between the lengths of the physiologists and biomechanists and trying to merge both, okay? And other area that is very interesting for us is game analysis. So having said that and reinforcing my compliments to everybody here, I have 2 main concerns or 3 main concerns about what the professor said. And please let me congratulate you about your speech. It was really nice. This is only the start of the conversation. Then you can ask every question that you want. My first question, my first concern is related to ethics in sports science, and mainly related with invasive methodologies that sometimes we use. And when we speak about invasive methodologies, we are always concerned about taking venous blood or capillary blood from subjects. That is important, but biopsy is growing each year, mainly in soccer players. So it's really up-to-date methodology that we are starting to do, and we need the medical doctors with us to do this kind of procedures. But following Marta's speech, I want only also to introduce the question: invasive methodologies are not only the ones related with blood samples. When we pass a questionnaire or when we make an interview, that can make also to be very invasive to the subjects, depending of the questions. So I'm divided between these two approaches, and I have a number of problems in my head that it could be very nice to discuss with you if you want. Then related with short samples, short number of subjects. In fact, I need to agree with everything that was said. But for instance, when we are using elite athletes, for instance, the 8 finalists of an event on the Olympic Games, we only have 8. We don't have 16 or 100 or 200. We have that sample that is very short, but we need to take care, of course, of the other related statistical approaches to be sure to pass the right information and to be able to replicate if we find the proper sample. It's not so easy, but that is also a concern of us when we have shorter samples, because we only have access to 10 subjects or 20. Okay. 2 more brief topics, so we can speak if you want about those. Many of us and people from the audience, maybe, we are acting as associate editors or researchers in some sports science related journals. Okay, it's part of our daily life to edit the submission of papers and then, or to make the review of some papers. I'm actually in some of the predatory journals that were spreading some years from until now. I'm still there. And I'm still there because I'm trying to be there to implement good practices. So I prefer to be there than to jump out and only criticize. I prefer to be there. But it's a very hard job, in fact, because the pressures are daily pressures. You need to answer in 5 days. You need to present this. Are you sure that you want to reject? This kind of approaches I don't like, but I prefer to be there and say, I don't like this type of pressure than to come out, but it's not easy. And lastly, because I'm not young anymore, but I'm not old, I'm in between. I remember when I was a student that we learned mainly from books and from manuals. And that in that time, where the first PhDs in sports science appeared, they presented some panoramic theses, not theses by papers. But now, if we don't pay close attention to the words that were said, maybe we follow the trend that say publication is prostitution. The people that publish are only think about money. The reviewers are only think about money. The journals are only think about money. So maybe we should stay in the middle, not saying only books are right, and not trying to publish 30 or 40 or 5 papers per year. And being in the middle is always very hard, because we are not in this group, and we're not in this group. We are trying to be the most correct persons and to follow the most correct procedures. And this is hard. Thank you.
Professor Ekkekakis, do you want to maybe do a short review about what we have spoken, then I'll do mine.
Yeah, so to me, there are different aspects to this problem. One is improving our science, and we talked about this. I'm sure we will talk more about this. Another aspect that I want to bring up, and hopefully the audience may have some comments or questions about is the issue of evaluation criteria for young faculty. We have a problem in our field with defining excellence. How do we understand the concept of academic excellence? Obviously, as became evident from what I said, I strongly believe that we should move away from counting. Counting is the easy way out. Counting can allow a committee that does evaluations, either a search committee or a promotion committee, within seconds to put a number on the forehead of a young faculty and say this person is worth this much because they publish 6 papers a year, but this person is worth that much because they publish 10 papers a year. That's easy. We should aspire to something better and more meaningful than that, even if it requires more work. In addition to that, if you study the career trajectories of the people who are currently at the top of our field, you will not find numbers in most cases anywhere near the kind of numbers that we're talking about, 10 papers a year, 12 papers a year. There are some that have done that. But there are people who establish themselves as leaders in our field over 30, 35-year careers, publishing 3 articles a year.
Okay.
But there were 3 articles a year that changed the way we do science. So evaluation procedures will have to be more sophisticated, more meaningful, even if that takes more time.
Great, thank you for sharing that. So I'll also have a brief, I'll present my brief ideas about this. So maybe some of you have received a few emails from me recently, and now I'm signing something like #NeverStopSciencing. So the idea that science is really important in everything that you do. And for me, sciencing, it's almost like a game, like playing. So I really enjoy finding new stuff, finding new things, and the methods that are behind these finding new things are what drives me to do science. But as a play and as a game, because science can also be looked up as a game, there's going to always be bad players. And we need to have that critical appraisal capacity to figure it out who are the less good players, not to call them bad players. And when I'm saying bad players, it's not only the researchers themselves, but the publishers, the funding agencies, and specifically the bad methods that can be used to, as you just noticed, to kind of to find what you want to find and not what is there. And this is maybe one of the concerns that I have mostly when I teach or try to teach the PhD students, that they should develop as much as possible the critical appraisal. But it's not enough to have the courses that we teach here so that you can find your own critical appraisal. It should be something that you always strive for. The methods themselves are a process that, in learning the methods itself, it's a process that I think should be pursued by you. And finally, the thing that it's kind of concerning to me is that because the bad players and something that is bad, it's usually it's more noticeable for us. You know, the bad side, the car accidents paradigm. So you can drive by, I don't know how many cars that doesn't have an accident and just don't notice them. And then when there's an accident, you just stop. We also do this for the bad science or the things that are not that good on science. So recognize that those situations happen. They usually steal our attention, but there's also very good science. And so instead of maybe leaving from this room in this session, oh my gosh, this is all bad and the world is ending and this is not the place where I want to be. I also consider that there's a lot of sign that is good, and that one should be the one that we should try to pursue and follow. And again, be conscious and concerned about the bad players. And so I think we have presented kind of our positioning. Of course, I'm also for open science. I'm also very concerned about the evaluation of faculty and the potential bad practices or invasive or ethical things about data collection and all that. But now I want to hear from you. So any questions, comments? We have 45 minutes for this. Indeed. Go ahead.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you for your comments. We have talked about mostly bias coming from the researchers, from their methods and their desired approach. But what do you think is the role of publishers in all this, and more specifically, open access? And how is this also increasing the epidemic that Professor Ekkekakis is speaking about, publish or perish?
So the publishers, the issue that the publishers positioning about publishing a lot of papers and all that, is that?
Yeah, what is their roles on this culture of publish or perish and open access?
Maybe I can start. I think open access doesn't have anything to have with publish or perish, at least on my thing. It's just a way for you to have access to all the everything that is published on science. What I think it may be happening is that, and I was thinking about this when we were talking about when Professor Ekkekakis was talking about the presentation, is that there is funding to do the research and some scrutiny about that process. It's very difficult to have a grant funded and then to conduct the funding or the trial as it was designed, and if there are deviations, you need to report and all that. And then there's very little resources aiming at the quality of the publisher, either on the review process or even at the publishing process. So it's kind of we let business take over the publisher part of things, while science, we usually have very large concerns about conflicts of interest and all that, but not with the publisher. So I think there's an imbalance that may be leading to this, but this is my comment.
Can I go ahead? Yeah, I'm happy with that. I think we need to make a bit of a distinction when we talk about open access journals. We have a huge variety of journals, right? So being open access or not should be separated from the quality of those journals and what they accept or don't accept in terms of publishing. And that was something that was already mentioned a bit. And also you have journals that are hybrid, right? So you can publish as open or not. I think one issue with open journals is actually that it brings inequalities in terms of the amount of research you can publish, because researchers that don't have large amounts of funding to publish, they won't be able to publish in those journals. And most of the journals are moving into that direction. So I think, if any, they can slow down the process of publishing, because you don't find journals where to publish if you don't have money. And this is one issue, and I think it's a very serious issue. And then I think there's the other side that Ricardo mentioned, which has to do with journals that actually publish anything that is submitted, and they don't even look at what is in there. And those, I think, are a huge issue in terms of, ensuring that some researchers are capable of publishing 30 papers about the same thing in 4 months if needed, or the same papers in different journals, which we have seen, like exactly the same papers. But I think in this conversation, I think it is important to separate both things. because they have different implications in terms of, you know, the quantity, the quality, the practices in terms of open science and research quality. And I think that's an important aspect.
Yes.
Yeah, you said everything that I wanted to say. So open access is a little misleading in my mind. Because still somebody has to pay. And the amounts that especially the reputable journals are charging for open access are astounding. There was a lot of discussion recently about one of the Nature journals, not Nature itself, but one of the Nature journals charging, I don't know, $13,000, you know,
It's
for
the human behavior one.
Yeah.
Charging 15,000.
15,000, you know, to publish a paper. Well, what percentage of researchers and from which countries have the resources to then publish open access? Those prices are, you know, they're horrendous. So then it creates a market for bad players, because there will inevitably then be the publishing house from Pakistan that will allow you to publish for $180, right? So I'm very skeptical about all of these things. I'm going to stop there.
I just want to complement in one information. It is a personal feeling, and it's from my own brief history. So I started, as many of us, as a reviewer, invited reviewer. I started to be a reviewer when I published my first paper, because my name appeared on the databases, and then I received my first invitation to be a reviewer, maybe 3 months after my first paper was published. It's normal to be like that. And after 10 or 15 years, I was invited to be a member of an editorial board. And in those moments, we are able to have meetings with all the other members, so we can pass our beliefs about things. If they are going to change something, I don't know, but we have that possibility to transmit our way of thinking to the other colleagues. That is one thing that I think it's positive. Just another information. As you all know, there are big journals, very ranked journals, and not so important journals. And at some time I was invited to be, I don't know if it is from Pakistan or other place, but from India or somewhere, to be editor-in-chief of a sports science journal. It's open, and people don't need to pay to read, and people do not need to pay to submit. Then there is a brief amount of money to publish, but it's short. After three years there, I received an email saying, "Thank you for your efforts. We don't want to count on you anymore." They didn't give me any reason, but I know, because I feel these things, that I was very strict with the selection of the reviewers and the selection of papers that were published there. So I know that I was said, "Thank you, but you can go out." So but every place is like this. I don't think so, because after, I don't know, 1 year or 2 years, I received another invitation to be editor-in-chief, now to a Portuguese journal, where I don't receive any pressure at all. So at the end of the day, I think the good practice can win if we all work together towards this path, and we stay strict and we stay honest. It's my personal opinion. Thank you.
Can I just add something on the reviewer process before other questions? And for those of you in the room that actually want to do a research career, and if that happens, as you were saying, you'll be invited to review papers, which you may accept or not if you feel you have the expertise. But I think that one thing it is important when you start to review papers is be really clear about the skills that you have for reviewing that paper and where you have limitations. And nowadays it's quite common that you are asked, do you have the statistical expertise to analyze the way that it was analyzed and other types of things. And I think that I know that when we are especially starting our careers, we want to show that we are proficient on everything, right? But that's not the case, and you will never be. So there are things that you will be, really knowledgeable about, and other things that your colleagues will be knowledgeable about. And it's really important when you're doing those reviews that you're also very honest in saying, I review this part, I'm confident with this assessment. There are this and this and this issues that I'm not entirely sure, and I think this needs someone who is an expert on the methods or a specific statistics to look at it. And I think this is, it's becoming more and more of a common practice. And I think it also helps with the issue that sometimes a reviewer may not notice problems in the analysis because they don't know how to assess those problems in the analysis, because their knowledge about the statistics is not enough for that specific method that was used.
Great. Anastasia, maybe then.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anastasia. I'm a second year PhD student. So just to add to the first question, if we circle back to the initial concepts of researchers having to pay to publish the results of their research and their scientific findings, if we circle back to that, and if we imagine a situation where the research that you publish and that you submit is rewarded financially, but at the same time, you would have a more strict selection process with more rigor, with more standards, just statistical review, everything. Would that replicate the situation in time with the doctoral staff when researchers were active financially, or in the research that they published? Or would that situation, theoretical situation, hypothetical, be able to increase the quality of the general worldwide research that is published? If we go back to the fundamentals of scientific publishing, could we change something about it? Or
I will just start from this. I think it's also very important for us to know the publisher perspective. So to work with them, and sometimes we can say that they are all bad and they only want to do money, but they are a business, and the business they are created to make money. And it seems that they are now, at least the ones that I work with, and I did work with them quite closely because of one society that I'm executive director. They seem to be increasingly interested in having better quality in terms of the review process and all that. But the way that the business or the financial engineering that is behind it's called APC, so the Associated Publishing Cost, was designed, doesn't allow yet for that. So they are now looking, maybe we need to make less money to provide more quality to the reviews, and then stay as a, let's say, as a publisher that you can trust, or they need to charge more because they say, okay, for us to have this, a statistical person to look into each paper or whatever, we need to pay that person, and the APC will be increased. So it's a tricky business at this point because it's so high that I don't know why they charge 15,000 euros.
Because they can.
And but I always and they can, but I always ask them, can you please provide me a table and say, okay, 15,000, 1,000 is for this, 500 is for this, 12,000 is for this. Can you please present me a table with where do you spend that money, where do you invest that money? And they just don't have a clear idea. What we know is that Springer was the gross money that was involved with Springer last year was $1,500,000,000. So it's a big business. Okay. But I don't know if you want.
I was just gonna, I'm not necessarily going to answer your question, sorry. I'll leave it to other people. I just wanted to add something because I think it is important. Because I still feel like when we talk about open access journals, we always look at it as the bad. And I said this before, but I just want to say that because I forgot to mention this before, and I think that is important. There are also open access journals that you don't have to pay fees. So for example, I don't know if you ever heard about the F1000 research platform, which mainly you have journals that are associated with funders. So if you're working in a project that is funded by the European Union, you can publish your research in related to that project, and it goes to the same process of review, etc., in the journal from the European Union. If you're funded by the Wellcome Trust, you can do the same thing. And those are also good alternatives for certain papers that you pay nothing. The quality or the way that is done is good, and it has an amazing advantage for me is that when you publish on those platforms, whatever you submit stays automatically as a preprint. So it's like your version 1. Anyone can comment, anyone can review, and you can submit multiple versions with a justification of what was changed based on the reviewers or based on the comments that were made. And they request that everything that you did is published alongside with the paper. So I just wanted to make a note of this because I was forgetting that there are also good examples. It's just an example, is the F1000 research. They are associated with multiple journals. And I'll leave for the rest of the people to answer your question directly.
Any comment? I don't think we need
Answer
all
or comment.
to answer
Yeah,
to
if you
every
want.
question, but if you want to comment, please feel free if you don't. It's fine.
Just as an example, following Marta's idea, sorry, I really don't know the name that they attributed to this, but I work with International Journal of Sports Medicine. That is a very interesting journal, and some of the submissions are going to the normal process. And okay, I remember now. And some alternative way of reviewing, the name is crowding or crowd review. So it's open, and reviewers can put their comments, and everybody is seeing what is happening. So I think we are starting to have other possibilities of putting things more easy to follow. And well, I wouldn't want to say it's more honest, because there are reviewers that are really, really honest, and companies that are struggling to be honest. But there is an alternative way of, and the authors can ask for this kind of approach. That is nice as well.
Is this about your discussion? Because Anna, she was asking first, and let me just say, I think I mentioned this, and I will give you access right now. I think the system is adjusting. It took us a while, maybe 10 years, to realize that this thing that was happening was not good. But this open science and peer reviewing that is more open, and not only the final manuscript, but all the review comments and all the different versions of the manuscript are available so that you can see the process. All the data is available, all the syntax, everything is available. It allows the science to confirm or to analyze itself. And so the science in it's becoming maybe a little bit better. But Anna, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm in my third year of PhD. First of all, I would like to thank you for this amazing experience. And my question is quite simple, but maybe the answer not. It's about peer review. I would like to know your opinion about this kind of work being paid. And I don't know if it means the bad science or the good science.
Comments? I can say that it's tricky, because it should be part of at least the academics and the researchers who are paid to do this as part of their work. As a professor, I need to do community work. So as a professor, I need to do research, and it's part of my contract. So it's also part of my contract to do peer review. But it's not part of my contract to do 30 peer review per month and have a request you need to answer by in 5 days. So that's more difficult. So maybe for those situations, there may be some rewarding system for the peer reviewing. It's complicated again, because you may start having professional peer reviews or peer reviewing peers, I don't know how to call them, and they may not do science, and so it's tricky. And again, it's very interesting to see how publishers are trying and they are testing, at least Springer, that's the one that I know a little bit best, that they are doing trials, they are doing research on, let's try to have money for this, let's try to have some waivers for this, let's try to make, I don't know, to pay for a conference for these ones, and see how the process of the reviewers feel about it and behave. So it seems that they are trying to do something. I don't think they are doing enough, not at all, but at least there seems to be trying to do something.
I can add to that. I also agree that it's really complicated. So the question is simple, the answer is complicated. I know some people are very strongly on the side that we should be paid as we shouldn't work for free. Other people are on the opposite side, that if we get paid to do that, that can lead to more bias when you're reviewing papers or doing too many papers and then you don't have enough time to do like good quality reviews. I agree with António. I think that if it is all clear as part of our evaluation systems in universities that peer reviewing or being on editorial boards together with other things is part of our work, that's a bit different. But it shouldn't be associated with a number, right? Because some people might do 50 amazing reviews a year, other people, might only have capacity to do 2 or 3 amazing reviews a year. What I think is that sometimes, I don't mind doing reviews, I like it, I learn from it. It's really important for me as a researcher to do reviews. As António was saying, sometimes we're invited to do 70 a year, that's not possible, so we just need to say no. But I think that the system of reviewing sometimes asks you for things that you shouldn't be doing as a reviewer, like checking if it is in accordance with, the formatting for the references or the formatting for the tables. I shouldn't do that as a scientific reviewer. That's why you have people working in a journal that can do that. So I think there are ways to simplify your work as a reviewer to make sure that your review is a scientific review, support you in that process, and there isn't enough interaction in that process to make it a better experience to everyone. And in that respect, I think that most researchers don't refuse reviews because they don't think it is important. Sometimes it's really because it's too much, or because they don't feel comfortable, or because they don't like the way that journals approach them in reviewing papers. That's a bit of my view on that.
Other comments?
I will use your question. Thank you for it. I will not say anything more about reviews because they said it all. I agree completely. But just to make a statement, I think that there are companies and journals that they are abusing of their power, in fact. But for instance, MDPI, I will not make any judgment, but they were very clever because they offered discount vouchers to the reviewers. If you review this paper, you can have a voucher of 100 euros to a future submission of yours. And I don't know if this is a bad procedure because I received 0 for reviewing. If I receive a voucher to help me in a future publication, why not? I can use that. So they were clever in that way. And yes, I agree that they are publishing many and abusive number of special issues. But when they asked me, do you want to propose a special issue? Well, they were really strict in the text that I proposed and in the colleagues that I proposed. they did not accept immediately. They make a number of comments on that, so it was not immediate. Maybe the traditional companies are also learning from these supposed predatory companies, because I remember when I started, I waited for 6 or 7 or 8 months to receive a reply to a submission. These guys are asking 2 weeks. Maybe it's very, very small time for a reviewer, but waiting 6 or 7, 8 months, it's too long. So maybe again, we should stay in the middle between these type of approaches.
Hugo?
I have 2 questions. Can I make them both?
No, just one.
Half of a question.
So one is my one is the big part of the question. The first one, how do you see the role of preprints and preprint servers as a way to facilitate the progression or the dissemination of what we are doing? The several mechanisms that, for example, Marta suggests are really important to ensure the quality of what we are doing, the integrity of what we are doing. Sometimes I feel that having the paper, not that my research is that important, but that someone that has relevant information to share, relevant results to share, and the paper is in the journal, 8 months waiting for the project, perhaps, and although the paper is not reviewed, and sometimes, or at sometimes it's not peer reviews, how do you see the role of this kind of mechanisms in the way of advancing the speed of the innovation of sites, not the other question about the revision process. A second question is probably more redirected to my question to colleagues, of course, that's exactly what the ideas I am going to listen. But it relates with a concern of mine and the possible problem that the Portuguese science that is done is published in non-national journals. So I will try to explain this a little bit different. So I'm starting to feel that although we publish some papers and we do our research and we try to aim the best journal, the journals that are more aligned with the topic of our research, we find ourselves often inclined to choose journals that are in English. Because English is the word of sectional or very universally used language. However, not everybody in Portugal is a fluent reader of English, let alone complicated terms and methodologies that we should hard to get. So sometimes I feel that we should think about what kind of research we would like to share in Portuguese for students, for other researchers, for people that do not feel comfortable reading in English. I feel I am concerned that this would be a limitation development of our paradigm. But I give an example. Sometimes I make translations of English instruments to make psychometric evaluations for students, and I publish those articles in journals that are written in English. So this is a concern I would like to hear.
Anyone? The preprint maybe first.
I have lots of things to say for both things, but I'm feeling I'm just talking too much. Okay, so I'll start with the first one, preprints. I think from what I said before, I think, I'm all in favor of preprints and I think they are crucial. And I think there are different ways in which you can try to get review from those preprints also. So answering your question, if I understood correctly, I think we should disseminate what we are doing and not wait for the results of the peer review on a journal. If you think about it, a peer review in a journal is similar, to asking any of these people in this table to review my paper. So I think there are two things. I think you need, of course, to make sure that what you are sending as a preprint has the quality that needs to have. And sometimes what we do, just to give an example, we have just finished a paper on the ontology of behavior change techniques with colleagues from UCL. And we know that this ontology of behavior change techniques is going to be a paper that a lot of people is going to look at because of the taxonomy that is used as part of research and has a lot of citations, as you know. So we wanted to publish as a preprint on Open Science Framework before publishing in Welcome Open Collection, which is also preprint, so that we could get feedback from the research community in this first version of the preprints in a more of a, a quick way. So we did like a form to get feedback. And then we resubmitted a preprint of the paper based on that feedback, but with the history of the changes. So what I'm trying to say is that you can be creative in making sure that what you are submitting as a preprint and disseminating is already good enough in a way. Because don't forget that a lot of times the reviewers are not only looking at the quality of your method, sometimes it's really the writing, the way you're saying things. I do think, however, that if you disseminate preprint research, so before peer review research, you need to be really, really careful on how you frame that when it comes to the public. And this leads with one thing that was mentioned in your talk at the beginning, although it wasn't the main focus, but we were talking about communicating science. And I think we need to be very clear that when we say this study was done, we say this study was, reviewed in this context, was not reviewed scientifically, or whatever it is. That needs to be clear. And what happens now, and that was seen a lot during COVID, was that we're having a lot of papers that were being published rapidly on preprint servers, of course, because people wanted to know what was going on, but the way this would come to the media sometimes wouldn't be clear enough in saying that these are initial papers that weren't yet reviewed by the scientific committee, or if they were, who reviewed them in a way. Was it a network? Was it open review? What was it? So I think that we just need to be careful with that. And I will not answer the second one now because want to hear everyone else if there are any other comments.
Just maybe a short comment about preprints. Yeah, the main idea is this one. Preprints should be mostly for the scientific community, but they are being read by someone that it's not maybe aware of what the preprint is. And so there's very different interpretations, and I'm saying the press usually, or someone that goes to these servers, and for them a preprint is exactly the same as a peer review paper. And as you've seen with Professor Ekkekakis' presentation, even the peer review papers have a lot of issues. So if the preprints are kind of put on the same spot or in the same spotlight as peer review, so we have an issue. So that's the only concern that I have regarding preprints.
I just want to say regarding the second question, I completely agree with Professor Teixeira that English is the universal language for transmitting science. But people that are doing their PhDs, as you are, I'm sure, that you need also to have an historic idea of how things started. So I should remember journals that were not scientific like we see today, but Horizonte and Treino Desportivo, for instance, they were really great at that time. Really, really great. And my professors, the pioneers in sports science and physical education in Portugal, they all wrote their texts there that helped myself and people from our generation to study sports science. And of course, now we are trying to be as good as colleagues from France, from the States, from England, etc., publish at the same level. But people from PhD should struggle to publish at that level, but you should not forget about Mutriz, that is a very nice journal in Brazil, that can publish in Portuguese and English. Revista Portuguesa de Ciências do Desporto, that can publish in Portuguese and English. So, okay, the PhD should aim to this level, but not lower level, but different level articles are also welcome, I think, in your PhDs, trying to catch different type of people interested in sports science, coaches, practitioners, personal coaches, and other colleagues.
Any comments on this one? So maybe I can
Go ahead.
just one about this second question that you made. And this is an individual position that I've been following with my PhD students, is that, okay, we're doing by papers, so the thesis is presented by papers, but I always ask them, one of them has to be in Portuguese, okay? And has to go to Revista Portuguesa de Ciência do Desporto, Retos, Motriz, and sometimes it's not good for my age index.
Okay.
Not at all, because that's another issue when you are advising your citations index goes down, but it's fine. I don't mind. Well, I'm in the position to not mind that much right now, but maybe this is something that you can also consider while doing your PhD, or if you are advising, okay, just at least one of the 3 or one of the 4 should be published in Portuguese.
And Motricidade, for instance, is another journal.
Sorry, but it is exactly these kind of measures that I think that aligns with what Professor Ekkekakis was saying, when we should go away or put aside some metrics and find strategies, methods to help researchers to go and to be evaluated in a different way. We know that Portuguese journals do not have impact factor. They are not heavily cited because, well, the country is small, well, in English is going to be something in Portugal, then use it on their research. So I think this is one good example of something you can.
No, my comment was in that direction. I think that, the more we are moving to different ways of assessing and reducing the quantity, age index is not anymore considered in a lot of funding agencies in Europe, for example. I don't know the situation in the US, but the more we move towards that, the less this will be a problem, I think. But I have different views in terms of publishing in Portuguese or in English. I think it really depends on what is your purpose. So if your purpose is to disseminate what you did scientifically, get feedback on that, show the method that was used, showed how it was implemented, showed issues that arose from that, you need to publish in English because you need the international community to read that. There's no other option. I mean, you can publish in a Portuguese journal, but you need to write in English language. If your main purpose is to write a paper for either Portuguese scientists or for implementation purposes, then it's absolutely fine that you publish in Portugal. And as António was saying, I think it's up to supervisors, to universities to support that. Having said that, I think that this will be less of an issue in the future for 2 reasons. One, in a very few moments in time, you will be able to have everything translated using AI with perfect translation from English to Portuguese or the other way around. So that won't be an issue anymore. You will have things in English and Portuguese, whatever is the language, and you can make it available. And I do think that the publishing system is going to change, and we are moving to this democratic movement in terms of publishing and people building all of these platforms like the Center for Open Science, trying to get away from the publishing system traditionally as we know. So I think that in a few years, you will just have everything available in different platforms with different languages, and people won't be looking at the scientific journals as we know them. So I'm not saying that we will reduce the scientific quality of things or process. I'm just saying that they'll be available in a different way. And the third thing, just one last thing, I think sometimes it's not even having the same paper in English or in Portuguese. I think sometimes it's us being able to write shorter, more science communication-based papers that translate what we do in research for what is useful in practice. And for that, I think we don't have enough outlets to publish in Portugal, and probably also happens in other countries.
And also tools ourselves. We don't know how to write in that. And let's not drop the bomb that maybe with the reviewing process maybe starting to be done with GPT instead of ourselves.
And writing papers with
And
GPT.
write papers, and that's another thing. But
So the world is ending, António, as you said.
no, I'm saying it's shifting. It's shifting. It's adapting. I think we have time for one last question. Anyone? Maybe I would say that if you can, when I start reviewing, I bought a book because there's books for this, How to Be a Reviewer. Robert Steinberg or something that helped me a lot, helped me to think about. And I was not a reviewer yet. I was writing as an author, but to be in the position of the reviewer or to know what the reviewer is looking at, it's very interesting.
Can I just say, are you going to finish or can I
I'm trying to have another question, but I don't know. Maybe you can.
I have a question for you. So we're talking about ChatGPT and AI, and I'm quite interested if you know if there are already any AI developed systems to actually identify problems with data in papers. You know, instead of being us looking at it. Have you heard about anything being done on that?
So surprisingly, there's a whole area of computer science that was developed way before this sudden explosion of AI for years, that we're trying to automate the process of evaluating the methodological quality of research. But obviously that was done by text mining. And in my mind, it was a little silly. So if you use the words blinded, assessors, check. If you use the magic words concealed allocation to treatment arms, check. And so forth. And even though there were thousands of people working in the area, I had to laugh because I don't think that will ever be a satisfactory solution. I think that unfortunately, we cannot get away from the very tedious, hard, demanding task of scrutinizing papers, especially because authors who want to deceive for whatever reason also are increasing their skills of deception.
So that it takes more time.
So if they learn how the machine scores a paper, it is quite easy to write the paper in a way that will fool the machine. It doesn't take that much effort. And this unfortunately applies to everything that we have been talking about, pre-registration. It breaks my heart. But you can fool pre-registration very easily. I'll give you the simplest example, and that is we will analyze the data by a group by time analysis, and you say nothing about the covariance. And then you have, of course it's going to be a group by time analysis, right? The question is, what covariance are you going to put in the model? So if you have freedom to then play with the covariance, you can find anything you want, as long as you know how to play that statistical game. So even though it's comforting to think we're starting these new admirable, commendable practices, open practice, pre-registration, and so forth, there are people who immediately start to think, how can I fool the system? These days, the case that's in the news, it's a spider researcher. I don't know if you follow the news, who had published all the fake data openly, thinking nobody's going to look. Unfortunately for him, somebody looked and they realized it's all made up, right? Other people, write in their paper, all the data for this study have been deposited with the Open Science Framework. You click, and it says, to obtain a copy of the data, please send a request to the authors. You send a request to the authors and they, you know, and they never reply. So there are always, you know, the minds that want to do harm always have ways.
This is kind of because we are into sports in some way, it seems like doping. So it's very similar. So there are going to be always those bad players, and there's always going to be some sort of good players that want to fight those situations. But it's hard for us that try to play nicely to see that others may go very fast and get the funding or get the positions in academia, and they are doped, I would say. Well, but this is, I think this is life, and I didn't want to end in a negative way, and not at all, because as I was saying, it seems that the system is correcting itself, and for now maybe we have a more greener and more positive couple of years in terms of science. But then something else will show up. Maybe it's AI or something that starts writing papers and we just don't know what's happening, or maybe not. So just maybe the critical appraisal, those 4 or 5 things that you suggested, and for the PhD students that at least I think were listening to me when I did the PhD first class, the Leonardo da Vinci guidelines, I think they are still very interesting to follow, and it's critical appraisal and think about things in a very positive way. So with that said, I don't know if you want to have some other comments. We are 3 minutes away. That's why I was looking into that. So I would really like to thank everyone. I'm really grateful for having you all here, and I think we will do something like this maybe in the near future, because in the near future we're going to be speaking about other things, but the main ideas I think are still the same: the critical appraisal, to be fair and to play fair this game, and never stop sciencing, as I was saying. Okay, so thank you so much for this. Yeah. Obrigado.
They leave our boomerang table.
Boomerang table. And you want my smell? Obrigado, muito obrigado.
Não quero almoçar connosco? Não quero.
Não, eu ontem. Porque o padelzinho é golfe. Não é golfe. Tem pena não estar lá em cima, vocês têm. Temos aquele kit chiguinho. Muito obrigado. Até logo. Muito obrigado.
Okay.